Academica Media. From Academica Media Studios in Miami, Florida, it's Big Ideas in Education, a weekly recap of inspiration and innovation in your schools.
Welcome, everyone, to this week's installment of Big Ideas in Education. I'm Ryan Kairalla, and we are on location at the Florida Charter School Conference School Choice Summit. There is both hustle and bustle. I see people walking all around, amazing education professionals within arm's reach, and I got a couple of them right here, our guests this week. We're talking about legislative advocacy this week, and so joining us for this conversation are Sara Clements, the Vice President of State Government Relations for McGwire Woods Consulting, and Lindsay Hoyt, the Founder and Governing Board Chair of Cornerstone Classical Academy. Both of these professionals have used their talents and experience in the public and private sector to achieve huge policy outcomes in education right here in Florida. You can find out more about our guests' work by visiting McGwireWoods.com and CornerstoneClassical.com. Sara and Lindsay, very nice to have you both on the show.
Thanks so much for having us.
So let's start with this. Can each of you tell us a little bit about your particular roles and how they involve legislative advocacy? We'll start with you, Sara.
Well, thanks so much for having me on the show. And currently I work for McGwire Woods Consulting, as you said. We're a national consulting firm. We have offices in 9 states and D.C., and I'm located in Tallahassee. And most of my practice at the firm is consulting for pre-K-12 education clients. So we represent everyone from curriculum and assessment providers to district schools to colleges and universities, early learning providers, and just consult and advise for companies and nonprofit organizations that are looking to do business in Florida or expand their current business or engagement in the state.
So you're coming at this from the consulting side, kind of the outside looking in perspective. Lindsay, you're right there on the school campus, founding schools. Can you talk about your role?
Absolutely. So I'm the board chair, but I also started as the founder of Cornerstone Classical Academy, and I started it for my girls. I had no background in education. I just really wanted to see a classical school. We had no purely classical schools in Jacksonville at the time, and so I thought, what better opportunity than this is than just start a school. So what I didn't realize, though, was how political it turned out to be. And when we really drilled down in it, we realized that advocacy and the legislative process was so important and key in winning and getting our charter and then being successful. So I also serve as the executive director of the 2 Jacksonville Classical Academies in Jacksonville. And so that's been a very interesting opportunity as well. So I went from, just being on the board, which is a big role and a lot of responsibility, to now, overseeing essentially being the CEO over 2 campuses.
Now, Lindsay, we're hearing a lot about classical education. The last couple of years, it's really come along. We got a lot of classical education schools that are popping up, not just in Florida, but nationwide. For the uninitiated, can you tell us a little bit about the classical education model? What makes it different?
Well, classical education actually started with the Greeks and the Romans, so it's nothing newfangled. Up until the early 1900s, every single American was basically taught this way. So it's traditional American education. That's how I boil it down. This is like your grandparents' education. This is probably like your education if you're in your late 30s and going on up. But on steroids. So we teach all the major subject areas, so math, science, history, literature, Latin. We teach logic and rhetoric, and we really want students to not be taught what to think, but how to think for themselves. So that's why it's exploding, is because we're going back to our roots, and what it really boils down to is that classical education really works. I've seen it with my own children and thousands now of students each day at our schools.
That's great. Now, obviously, because classical education is on the rise and you are, in your role, it's important for you to try to achieve good policy outcomes to kind of further this model and just to improve the state of education generally. I'd like to bring both of you in on sort of an overarching philosophical question that comes to mind first for me when I think of legislative advocacy, which is, how do we take the ideology out of it, right? What makes education unique, I would say, more so than almost any other policy field, is everybody comes in with their preconceived notions. Everybody comes in with their ideology. Everybody comes in, since we've all been exposed to education at some point in our life, we all have opinions and views on it. And that creates a unique challenge for advocates, because it can be really hard to get policymakers to just look at the data and to just look at the facts and to make fact-based policy decisions in education, because everybody's got their ideological baggage, everybody's got their preconceived notions. So in your work as advocates, and maybe we can ask this to Sara first, how do you get lawmakers to just look at the facts, to just look at the data, and to not bring that baggage into the policy discussion?
I have a lot of thoughts. I'm going to try to boil it down to just a few. One is the last question you just asked: how do you get lawmakers to just look at the facts, look at the data, make decisions that way? Unfortunately, I think a lot of that actually is what we're going to be talking about this afternoon at our session, which is building relationships with legislators, getting them to trust you, to trust that what you're saying is really in the best interest of kids, and it's not that you are not coming from an ideological standpoint, that you're not trying to push an agenda, but you have built a reputation of honesty, and that, hey, this is what the research says, or this is what the evidence shows in our experience, and just getting them to kind of pay attention to you as the messenger, I think is way more important than people realize. But when you initially asked me that question, or asked that question, I thought to a conversation I have all the time with my mom and other people, which is, well, why can't we just get the politics out of education? And I'm kind of a pessimist, I guess, because I do this every day in the Capitol, not just on education, but on all these other issues. And the fact of the matter is, as long as you have bodies like the legislature, you have the governor, you have elected officials and appointed officials making decisions and making regulatory, you're working within a regulatory framework where people with different ideas and different political views are in charge of making these decisions. It's inherently political, whether you think that it should be or not. And unfortunately, that's just the way our government works. And we have different political parties. Those people feel like they have to sort of be loyal to the quote unquote, ideas or priorities or agendas of their party. And so even when they want to do the right thing or want to do something different, they're kind of oftentimes beholden to views that they feel like, the people in their party or their constituency wants. And so so going back to what I said earlier, that's what makes that so important, is getting people to trust you, whether or not, you may agree on the political side, but they trust you as a messenger, and they believe that you really are there trying to communicate with the best of intentions.
What role does community building play in that regard, right? Because ideology and your preconceived notions about how education can work, certainly have an impact, but what also has an impact is a community coming together and telling a legislator, this is what we want, this is important for our community, listen to us, we are your constituents. So, Lindsay, can you talk about the role that community building plays in legislative advocacy? Is there really strength in numbers when you're trying to affect policy change?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have 914 students this year at Cornerstone Classical. We have almost 900 on our wait list alone.
Wow.
So
congratulations.
Thank you. But it's not been without a lot of hard work, blood, sweat, and tears to get to this point. But I will say that, when we're talking about community, part of the easiest part of my role and building that community has been that I grew up in Jacksonville. And so growing up there, Jacksonville is a big little town, I always say. And so everybody kind of knows everybody, which is great and also scary at the same time, because you can either have a really good reputation or a bad reputation. So I started building and trying to build this community back in 2018. And so it's been years and years in the making of speaking in front of groups and talking with moms and dads, accosting people at Starbucks, like, hey, you look like you might have kids. Here's my business card. I'm starting a school. So it's literally been just grassroots. And then what happens is, once you have that core family, especially our founding families, those families are the ones that, they took a huge chance on us. Most charter schools in the first 5 years, that's the most volatile that a school's going to have, and it's a risk because you're believing something, and you're actually putting your children, your most precious commodity in the world, in someone else's hands, and so that is a huge faith component that they had to have and had to make.
And as a charter school founder, you'd almost call those folks your co-founders.
Oh, absolutely. And they jumped ship. They were in magnet schools. They were in all these programs. They were in they had a wonderful seat at their private schools. And then they jumped.
Not get back.
Yeah, they might not ever get back in. And so they took that risk, and so that built a community. I'll just tell you, so this is the craziest thing. We had our first home football game this week on Monday night. And it was actually, because we don't have a field yet to play on, we got to play on my high school, at my high school stadium,
wow,
which was amazing. We had just alone, we had over 100 cheerleaders, like little baby cheerleaders all the way up to 9th grade, and we probably had at least 700 people there. We filled the stands, and I looked around, it was Cornerstone shirt after Cornerstone shirt, everybody's cheering. It's like we were in the state playoffs, but we built it because we care, and that's what Sara was talking about, is you have to show that you care. This is not about politics. I always say, though, where two or more are gathered, there are politics, but you have to get through that, and you have to really blow that whole premonition up, because at the end of the day, this is not about me. And this is not about you. This is about these kids, and it's raising the next generation of patriots to save the country. So that's why I do this every single day. That's why it's so important. And I say that time and time again. And people have originally thought, Lindsay, you are nuts. Like, what are you doing starting a school? Now they're like, man, I wish I would have believed you and put my kids in, because I can't get in. But that community, those parents are they feel so blessed, and they just go and talk about it to everybody. So it's been great. It's been a blessing for me and my family.
So I love what you said for two reasons. One, the idea of your classical school having a football team just makes me happy, because I'm just envisioning these kids like tackling their opponents and then trash talking them in perfect Latin.
Right.
Which is
that basically happens.
Which is spectacular, yes. So already I'm a fan. Secondly, I love that towards the end of your answer, you talked a little bit about your own background and your kind of entrance into education. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that with you, because you didn't start in education. You came from the private sector, and you became an education advocate, an education professional later in life. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you into this field?
Yeah, it was, looking back, 10 years ago, I would have laughed in your face if you would have told me that I was going to, work at a school and be in education, and this would be my number one priority in life, next to my family. So I actually started my career. I graduated from the University of Florida. I studied public relations, and 2 weeks after I graduated, I hightailed it up to Washington, D.C., where I thought I would save the country. I worked in lobbying and grassroots mobilization, and worked in media and fundraising until I got completely jaded, because the only people that have souls get jaded up in D.C. That's kind of my philosophy. And so
wow.
I got jaded pretty early on, and I left and I got into sales and recruiting. I loved it. I loved selling. I loved recruiting people, and I recruited people from all around the country. I did work in the education space a little bit. I did a lot of work with College Board. But other than that, I didn't really have any experience in education. But what really changed my whole life was, obviously, I had my kids, and then I realized that I was terrified about where to send them to school. And so that prompted me to start this school. And what was so great is all the jobs that I've had helped me in my career in education. So it helped me with recruiting, so recruiting staff, recruiting parents, selling them, because it really is a sales pitch, helping fundraising, talk to legislature. The legislators that I talked to, I wasn't as intimidated because I used to talk to members of Congress. And so it was like all the experience of fundraising I had to raise. We raised $250,000 to jumpstart our school, and then we got a $16.9 million bond so we could open our school. But all those things, we had to fundraise, we had to sell, and then, the grassroots mobilization was really important. We had probably over 350 letters of intent going in to starting our, submitting our application. So we were getting people to, go into libraries and, car washes, wherever we could to get signatures. So all those things really helped. Had I not had that experience, I don't think that the school would have opened, only because I wouldn't have had that knowledge. So it really did help me tremendously.
That's excellent. To me, that's low-key one of the coolest things about the charter school movement that I think allow these schools to get effective is because you have these boards of directors made up from people of the community. You wind up bringing in this really diverse set of expertise that a traditional public school might not normally have access to. So you get policy experts, you might bring in marketing experts, banking experts, and so those people can bring their non-education experience into the school and help that school handle the non-education aspects, the things that you might not think are important in running a school but are quite important. And you bringing in these people, that you might consider outsiders, to help handle some of these things for the school, and you can create some really amazing outcomes like you've done at Cornerstone. Question for you, Sara, that I wanted to ask you about now, getting back to the question of advocacy. Can you talk about a myth in education advocacy, something that people think has to be the case when it comes for advocating for education policy that's just not true in your experience?
Again, lots of answers to that question.
Sorry.
I think a myth generally, not just with education, but there's a myth that because you are a member of the legislature, because you work in state government, you must know, or because you're on an education committee, you filed an education bill, you must have all this prior knowledge of the education system. And then when you do something or you file a bill or you're pushing something that people in education don't agree with, they can't understand why, because they think that you should know better or you should know that this isn't going to work or whatever. But we have a citizen legislature. And, every state's different. But in Florida, these guys make $29,000 a year. They technically are only working about, 3.5, 4 months a year, although many of them, it really is a full-time job, but most of them do have a job outside of this. They go to work, they're an attorney, they're a doctor, they're a teacher, they're doing whatever, and then on the side, they're serving in this capacity. And they're not only making decisions on education, they're making decisions on transportation, on taxes, on wildlife, and literally everything you can think of, banking, environment, all these things, and they're constantly confronted with so many different policy areas, and they just don't have, the prior knowledge on all of these things. And so you never want to assume that they know or understand what they're talking about. And this is not a criticism. If I went and I ran for office and I became a state representative today, there's a handful of areas I would have a lot of knowledge in and feel very comfortable making decisions, and education would be one of them. But I know virtually nothing, about 90% of the other industries and areas that I would have to vote on. And so as an advocate, you have to understand, you have to start from the basics, assume that they know nothing. This is a big part of what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is don't assume that they know your industry. Don't assume that they know how these things work in practice, and don't get upset. It's really your job to educate them. And so when a bill comes out or policy that you disagree with, it's really about making sure they understand that I know you might think that it works this way, but in actuality, as a teacher or as a school founder or as a school director, here's how this works in practice, and you help them understand how to make a better decision or how to push better policy.
Thankfully, you all are in the education business, so you know a thing or two about educating people. So I feel like that gives education advocates a little bit of an advantage in the lobbying space relative to some other industries. You can find out more about our guests' work by visiting McGwireWoods.com and CornerstoneClassical.org. I've learned so much about legislative advocacy from both of you. I am looking forward to your session. I know the viewers and listeners will as well. This is really, really terrific. Let me close with this. I'm going to ask each of you our final question. We'll start with Sara. If with the snap of your fingers, Sara, you could make one change to the education system, what change would it be? I know. I already know what you're going to say. You have so many answers.
Actually, this one is hard.
Oh, this one you don't have any answers. Oh, no.
I mean, I know, and I don't want to say it, but I just wish we could start from a blank canvas. I think, unfortunately, the public school bureaucracy that we have in our country, it's so big, it's so mammoth. There's, you can chip away at different things and you can try to make it better. And there are many wonderful people who are working inside the system to make it better. But with a system as huge as it is, there's no way, again, maybe I'm a pessimist. I find it hard that we could ever truly transform public education given this massive system that we have. And I wish we could just start from scratch and not have to work through the current system we have.
Lindsay, same question for you.
Yeah, that's a loaded one. I have infinity answers, but I'll boil it down to, if I could change one thing, if I could make every single parent actually care about their child's education, that would be a game changer, because you can have the best curriculum in the world, you can have the best teachers in the world, you can have the best, most beautiful facilities, but if you don't have the parents that are supportive of the school, if you don't have the parents that are actively helping read to their children, when they're little, help with, geometry homework when they're in high school, go to the games, actually care, actually want to be involved, then it really isn't going to make as big of an impact. If not, you'll have a couple, but it's just, I've seen it firsthand. It's so sad and it's so tragic. But that's what I would do. I would just really want parents to actually care, all the parents to care.
Safe to assume that whether it's creating good education policy or just good education generally, it always comes back to parent involvement.
Yep.
That's super important.
Yep.
Sara and Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great conversation. Best of luck with your presentation. I'm sure it's going to be terrific.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
The views expressed on the preceding program have been those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Academica, its clients, staff, affiliates, or advertisers.